I got a serious topic to talk to you about, and I don't want to bore you to death with it. I don't want to sound like a broken record on it. And I know you're not going to hear a topic like this. It's not your standard conservative radio fare, but it's that important to me. No, we're not going theology today. We're going foreign affairs. And the reason is because there's been a coup attempt in the nation of Gabon. And it is not a good situation. The president is being deposed. The president himself is a bit of a dictator, and soldiers have decided to declare a coup after the president won his third term. His family comes from a political dynasty. His father had ruled since 1967. Now, why should you care about this? This goes back to the whole unknown thing I've been harping about. I've got this sense that there is something stirring in the shadows, and we don't have a good grasp of what it is as a nation because we've got an 80-something-year-old president who's asleep at the wheel, and his progressives that he has surrounded himself with in the administration, they don't care about this stuff. And let me put this in context that you can care about. In one African nation, they have decided to sentence to death 2 men, if you believe CNN, for being gay. And that's not actually true. The men are not being sentenced to death for being gay. They are sentenced to death for assaulting a wheelchair-bound senior citizen and raping a child. But the media wants you to believe it's because they've criminalized homosexuality, and that's why they're going to be executed. This, I think you can understand. Before we fled Afghanistan, our brave State Department decided to hoist the rainbow flag for Pride Month. Our brave State Department decided virtue signaling gay rights in Afghanistan before handing the country over to the Taliban was worth doing. They bravely did it in the Vatican as well. Western leaders right now care way more about this alphabet gang culture war than they do real national security. The result is that a lot of African nations that have rare earth minerals we need, oil we need, other precious metals that we need for Western industrialization, they're moving towards a sphere of influence with Russia, Iran, and China. Because American and European powers care way more about gay rights than they do national security. And China, Russia, and Iran realize this. Believe it or not, there are many nations on the planet, African nations, Asian nations, South American nations, that are culturally conservative. They're not into trans rights. They're not into gay rights, for that matter. And when the United States and Europe begin to pressure them on these cultural issues, they feel like they're having to give up their culture, oftentimes based on deeply held religious beliefs in the country. And they go towards Russia and China and Iran, which are not telling them you got to give up your cultural concerns. And by the way, we'll give you lots of low interest loans that aren't really low interest and have lots of strings attached. But the United States and Europe and Canada and the like, they hold their head up proud that, well, by God, we haven't dealt with this bigoted little nation in Africa. So the bigoted little nation in Africa gives their lithium supply to China and their oil to Russia and their nickel to Iran and their uranium to Iran. And along the way, what's happening is there's a series of coups across Africa. Gabon is the latest. Now, what happened here is the former president's son, who's now in his third term, wins an election that outside observers say is rigged. So a dozen soldiers announce it's a coup, closed the border, canceled the election, and dissolved the state institutions. It's happened in Mali. It's happened in Niger. It's happening in Sudan. They call this region the Sahel across North Africa. It stretches from the Atlantic over to the Red Sea, this area where you have society exists within the Sahara and the plains that lead into the Sahara. And it's becoming deeply destabilized. And it's becoming deeply destabilized at a time that Al-Qaeda is resurgent. Remember, Obama said they were gone. They're not. ISIS has set up shop there. The Islamic State, yes. Boko Haram, also an Islamic group. They may not care for each other, but they're more concerned with Christians and the West. And Russia has allowed the Wagner Group to go into this area and provoke these coups. We know the Wagner Group has been involved in the Mali coup. We know the Wagner Group has been involved in the Niger coup. We're not sure about Sudan, though it's suspected that Wagner's playing there. And we don't know yet about Gabon, but I wouldn't be surprised given the pattern. And what you have to understand about this is Russia does not want the Islamic radicals to win. The Islamic radicals are actually a huge threat to Russia. The Chechen situations and others, Islamic radicals deeply hate Russia. One of the reasons that Russia decided to get involved in Sudan, it's not just a natural alliance with Bashar al-Assad. What the Russians understood is that Chechen rebels who hate the Russians and Vladimir Putin went down to Sudan to fight, to get the skills and the weaponry to go back to Chechnya and try to have a revolution there. And so they got involved. Of course, they had ties. They had other geopolitical strategy there. But it was also because the Russians are deeply antagonistic towards Islamic radicals. So why then have coups and destabilize West Africa and allow the resurgence of the Islamic radicals? Because you know who hates the Islamic radicals more than Russia? The United States and Europe. Vladimir Putin is playing chess while we are playing checkers. You destabilize Western Africa and the Sahel. It requires the Americans and the Europeans to refocus there. If we refocus there, we're suddenly not focused on where? Ukraine, Iran, China, the South China Sea, Taiwan. We have limited resources. Remember, go back to Obama. Obama had a strategy that we should be able to win a war on two fronts. Or before Obama, our national military strategy was we should be able to win two great wars in two separate theaters concurrently. Obama decided we needed to start scaling back our military. And what we should do is be able to win one great war and maintain a level of control of the second theater until we win that war and then redeploy our resources to finish off. It's a dumb strategy. It has left us weaker and more vulnerable. And the Russians know it, and the Chinese know it, and the Iranians know it. And now we have as President of the United States a man who Barack Obama's own Secretary of Defense said has been wrong about everything in the last 50 years. There's something wicked festering in the shadows. We don't have a presidential administration that even is exercising a modicum of curiosity about it. Now, let me expand the larger picture here of what African nations are dealing with. Africa is the largest continent. I'm always amazed by the number of people who think that Africa is like 50 states. You got all these countries and they're just states. No, they're independent countries on this large landmass, and it is a ginormous continent. A flat map of the world doesn't convey to you the actual size of the African continent. It is poor. It is dealing with post-colonialism. It's dealing with corruption. It's dealing with military dictatorships, all sorts of problems. But it is oil rich. It is mineral rich. It is rare earth mineral rich. It is uranium rich. It has everything you need on that continent, divided by a bunch of nations. And the Americans and the Europeans have kept this continent pretty dirt poor. Why? Because there's a deep fear among Western environmentalists that if the African nations became industrialized, it would impact global warming. The thing that keeps environmentalists up at night is the fear of air conditioning throughout Africa and the fear of a population boom. And by the way, the African continent nations are the only nations still exploding in birth, and even they're declining some, but they're outpacing everybody else. And so what do Western elites say? Well, you can't have DDT to get rid of mosquitoes and stop malaria. You can have nets to sleep under at night. You can't have air conditioners. You just keep burning dung at night, even though it's not environmentally friendly. We would far prefer you do that than get air conditioners, because then you expand your electrical grid and you're going to be burning coal and oil and natural gas, and that's bad for the environment. We would rather you stay in poverty. So along come Russia, China, and Iran. They look at all the resources of the African continent and they say, hey, you know what? We'll help you build your power grid. We'll provide you cheap air conditioners for your people. We'll even provide you cars. In exchange, we want your cobalt. We want your lithium. We want your nickel. And, we'll take your uranium off your hands as well. Meanwhile, the Americans and the Europeans are like, well, if you're not willing to hoist the rainbow flag, we got to keep you in poverty. Guess which way these nations are going. And now in this West African region, the Russians are helping launch military coups to destabilize areas of Africa where Islamic radicals are trying to get a foothold in. So Americans will have to deploy their resources. And remember, Joe Biden has told everyone, hey guys, we're out of ammunition, we're out of weapon systems, we're out of tanks, we're out of missiles, we're out of bullets, we're out of guns, we can't do anything. And the Russians are looking at this and saying, hey, let's destabilize West Africa, let the Islamic radicals become resurgent there. We know the Americans are going to devote resources to go there. That'll help us in Ukraine. They are playing us. The Russians, the Chinese, and the Iranians, they're playing us in Africa. And our administration, led by a geriatric dementia-addled patient, is too stupid to realize what's going on. I, a radio show host in the middle of Georgia, can see what's happening, and Washington, D.C. cannot. It's profoundly absurd. But you know what? It has everything to do with left-wing ideology, from climate to the alphabet gang. They have shaped American foreign policy to conform to their convictions of wokeism. And guess what? Most of the world isn't down with wokeism. And now Russia, China, and Iran are seizing on our wokeism, turning it against us, and deploying diplomacy to Africa that's ultimately going to hurt us, while emboldening the very Islamic radicals who want to kill us. It's very obvious to anyone who has eyes to see that it's happening. Unfortunately, we're led by dementia-addled blind people in Washington, D.C. You should care about this story, even though it seems so abstract and far away, because this administration is letting something fester in the shadows of African nations that's going to drag us back into a war.